One of the principles is that systems are perfectly designed to achieve what they're achieving. So we talk about systems being in equilibrium or in balance. It's good that not everything is changing all the time. We keep our body temperature at 98.6 Fahrenheit. Ideally, we eat when we're hungry, we drink when we're thirsty, and then we stop eating or we stop drinking when we're full. Thermostats are designed to keep the room temperature at 68 Fahrenheit. I mean, there's balancing feedback relationships, equilibrium all over the place. In any case, when we talk about resistance to change, what we're really talking about is equilibrium. The system is well designed to accomplish something, and even though it might appear dysfunctional, we don't want a system that's accomplishing X, but in fact, the system is perfectly designed to accomplish X.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. David Peter Stroh is the bestselling author of Systems Thinking for Social Change, a practical guide for solving complex problems, avoiding unintended consequences, and achieving lasting results. For the past 40 years, David has helped leaders to apply systems thinking to organizational strategy and achieve breakthrough sustainable change. He's a founding partner of the influential consulting firm Bridgeway Partners, a faculty member of the Academy for Systems Change, and a charter member of the Society for Organizational Learning. In this conversation, we talk about how he was exposed as a child to both natural and urban complexity, growing up at Inwood, at the very northern tip of Manhattan, New York. How he fell in love with transportation systems, but ended up studying organizational development at MIT. How his search for greater impact and a seat at the table led him down the systems thinking path, and eventually to founding a consulting firm alongside Charlie Kiefer, Robert Fritz, and Peter Senge, later of the Fifth Discipline fame. We also discuss what's a system and what's systems thinking. Why do complex systems often yield unintended consequences? What are the benefits of system thinking, especially in the world of impact? What does it tell us about wealth inequality and poverty? And why David has come to see systems thinking as an almost spiritual practice. David's book and his blog are must-reads for anyone interested in making deep and lasting positive impact and avoid undesirable consequences. And this conversation can serve as a good and I think exciting intro to the topic. So let's jump right in with David Peter Stroh. So I'm sitting here with David Peter Stroh. David, welcome to the podcast.
Great. Thank you very much, Aaron.
And we focused in the pre-show mostly on getting the tech working. Hopefully we're able to do that. And what I would like to ask you is a mandatory question these days. If you can give me a quick update on where you are. I think you're in Berkeley. What's the situation with COVID? How are you doing? How did you survive the past year and a half of chaos?
Oh, I think I had it easier than a lot of other people in that I'm accustomed to working from home, and we have the beautiful Berkeley Hills 2 miles away. And so I was able to take some really lovely hikes in the hills, which are quite steep and with beautiful views. And business certainly slowed down. I found other ways to enjoy myself. And we're all vaccinated now in the family. We're about to go on our first flight since COVID started. We were on a road trip and that went fine. I'm very glad to not have to walk around with a mask all the time. And I must say, I feel like I and my family survived this much better, certainly, than many other people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this strange cognitive dissonance where you read about people suffering, and even some of my friends had a really rough time being locked in their homes, and I actually was flourishing. I started to learn the violin just because I felt like it, and I read a lot, started cooking, started running, lost some weight, and it's like the push that I needed to explore certain things. And in the meantime, there's definitely people going crazy, and of course, people dying and people losing their jobs and things that are very serious.
Yeah.
And so it's this cognitive dissonance. It definitely did not hit everybody the same, not on a health level, not on a financial level, and I think not even on a psychological level, because I have friends who are not different from me in finance and in being relatively safe, but were absolutely going crazy, especially my more social friends. Or absolutely going crazy at home. And I guess that shows me that I'm not as social as some of my friends. So as an opening to the conversation, and you have a fascinating background, and I loved your book, and I'm very interested in system thinking. So there's many topics that we could dive into. But as a way into this, there's a question that I usually ask, which I think is a really nice opening that hopefully leads us there, which is, what's something you've learned early in life, perhaps in childhood, that still drives you in what you do today? Is it still with you? And yeah, I know it's a tough question, so take your time.
It's a lovely question, actually. Even though I did not feel that way when I was growing up, I benefited from having European parents and growing up in America, but recognizing from a very early age that there are many different ways of seeing the world, very many different ways of enjoying the world. And it gave me a much broader perspective from very early on that life is richer and more complex and can be seen from many different angles. I think that if I were just growing up in the States without that kind of a background. So for me, at least, that was my initial introduction to the fact that there are different ways. It's valuable to have those different perspectives.
That's really interesting, and I can resonate because I grew up in a very complex place and in a very complex family. Sometimes that even those early experiences can teach you a lot. And so, how did it express itself, like early in life, as you move through this world that's not simple? How did you react differently than maybe some other kids?
Well, I think I had the benefit of foreign travel. When I was younger. I think the first time, trying to remember, I think the first time I was in Europe, I was 8, and we actually rented a house for a month outside of Nice, France. And in many ways, it was a horrible experience. We were on a hill, and the neighborhood kids would throw rocks at me from where they lived higher up on the hill, and the beaches are all pebbly. There's not sandy beaches, despite the fact that it's the Riviera. And yet I was getting exposed to different world right there. And then I traveled again when I was 11 and a half for about a month or so. My parents took me out during the winter break for a few extra weeks, and I remember traveling around the world doing homework and actually being ahead of where the class was when I got back, which was very fun. But I got, again, to see different countries and enjoy the fact that there was so much variety in the world. So I think that those are some early experiences. I would also say that although I grew up in Manhattan, one of the densest, most busiest places in the world, I actually grew up on the very northern tip of Manhattan and across from a place called Inwood Park.
Yeah, I was there just a few days ago.
Okay.
Visiting a friend.
So as far as I know, Inwood is the only primitive forest remaining in Manhattan. It's about a third of a square mile. It's surrounded by water on two sides. It's got dense woods, cliffs, Indian caves, no cars that you can run into. And that was my playground. So I was in nature, and I had more nature growing up than most kids in the suburbs, much less in the city. And then I could hop on the subway and be midtown in a half hour.
Yep.
And so I also had that experience of nature, really untouched nature, and urban life at the same time. And that was also a variety of experiences that I really came to appreciate.
Yeah, and they're both complex in their own way. Nature has its complexity, and then New York City definitely has its complexity.
Absolutely.
So,
And one of the things that I got out of living in New York, which kind of carried me many of the next steps, was that I really fell in love with transportation. I would always ride the subways in the first car, and that you can't even do that, but you certainly could in all the trains when I was growing up. And I would use my building blocks, and I would build road networks. And I seemed to have a good sense of direction, and I was the family navigator on Sunday drives, reading the maps, and I would draw maps for the fun of it, just make up maps and draw them. So I got interested in urban transportation from an early age. And that ultimately led me to two different academic sources or foundations. One was civil engineering, so the engineering or design aspect of the field, and the other was the social and psychological aspect of it. So I have a degree in urban studies as well. And so I was, fascinated in understanding and facilitating connections, which is what transportation is about, and recognizing that there was both an engineering or design component to that and also a social and psychological. So I got to MIT, and I was still planning to be an urban transportation planner, but I had done summer jobs in where you do urban transportation, which is mostly government bureaucracies, which I found deadly dull and inefficient. I read a chapter of a book that was written by one of my professors on the role of the integrator in society. And that really intrigued me. So I talked to him, and he said, "Oh, it sounds like you might be interested in organization development," which I had never heard of. And he directed me over to the Sloan School of Management at MIT, where organization development in the early 1970s was one of the originators. A lot of the well-known professors in what was still a very young field were teaching in that program. So I took a few courses, got very excited about that field, and decided that I was both very aligned with the values of organization development professionals, that work could be as much fun as play, and people are really much more responsible than we tend to give them credit for. And at the same time, I found that a lot of the OD practitioners did not have the ear of senior management, and that something was off. There were lots of great values, lots of nice ideas, but not all that much impact. So several years after graduating from MIT, and I actually have still a master's in city planning, I ran into one of my classmates, my first OD course, and he introduced me to what was becoming a burgeoning new age approach, if you will, to personal growth. Most of the personal growth techniques that organization development were connected to and built on had to do with expressing feelings. And the quote unquote new age approach was much more about recognizing the impact of one's thinking on behavior, the impact of structures on behavior, which was also part of traditional organization development, I would say, but also a very strong focus on the importance of aspiration, of vision and mission, and not just simply achieving goals for their own sake. So and because I think of the emphasis on structure and the emphasis on thinking rather than feeling, not that it's an either or, but which one to lead with, if you will, I think it was actually more palatable to senior executives. In any case, my classmate was starting a consulting firm that was integrating some of these ideas into management. And I got very excited about it, left a job that I had at the city of Boston, and decided to throw in with this classmate, whose name is Charlie Kiefer. And Charlie pulled together two other people, one named Peter Senge, who was at the time, a graduate student at MIT, studying system dynamics with Jay Forrester. And the other, a very unusual man who was a musician turned personal growth leader named Robert Fritz. And the four of us became co-founders of this consulting firm called Innovation Associates, which pioneered the ideas that Peter then put into his book called The Fifth Discipline about 10 years later. And the frame that evolved for this work was called organizational learning. And it combined systems thinking with visioning, with personal mastery, systems thinking, and team learning, I believe, were the five original disciplines, all built on the work that we pioneered in the late 70s and 1980s. And all of them are interdependent. So you can't really work on one very effectively without ultimately addressing all of them. The quote unquote fifth discipline, which is the title of Peter's first book, is systems thinking. And I guess because of my engineering background, I got particularly interested in leading with that. And I started doing some experiments where I would do organizational assessments for clients, but report back on those organizational assessments, not in terms of categories and lists of things that were wrong and suggestions for what to do, but rather in the form of interdependent, often non-obvious connection.
Yeah, maybe this is a good time to explain system thinking. You cite Donella Meadows, which she was my entry into systems thinking, where she's explaining a system as an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. And so how does that connect with, so what is system thinking with that definition of a system? How do you define system thinking for listeners who don't know what it is?
I think that a system is different from a group in the sense that the parts are interdependent. You can't really affect one part of the system without affecting other parts of it. The, to me, most telling part of Donella's definition is that last word, achieve something. And you'd think that a world famous systems thinker like Donella could have come up with a more specific definition, at least in terms of that last word, but it's actually a very deliberate word in the sense that one of the principles of how systems behave and evolve, and that's what systems thinking is. It's about understanding how complex systems, particularly in this case, social systems, although a lot of the principles relate to natural systems, ecological systems, and to physical systems as well. One of the principles about this is that systems are perfectly designed to achieve what they're achieving. So we talk about systems being in equilibrium or in balance. It's good that not everything is changing all the time. We keep our body temperature at 98.6 Fahrenheit. Ideally, we eat when we're hungry, we drink when we're thirsty, and then we stop eating or we stop drinking when we're full. Thermostats are designed to keep the room temperature at 68 Fahrenheit. I mean, there's balancing feedback relationships, equilibrium all over the place. And it always seems when those balancing structures work, we tend to not even realize that they're doing their job. And we're very aware of the other type of dynamic in systems, which is amplification, things getting better and better over time, or potentially things getting worse and worse over time. In any case, when we talk about resistance to change, what we're really talking about is equilibrium. The system is well designed to accomplish something, and even though it might appear dysfunctional, we don't want a system that's accomplishing X, but in fact, the system is perfectly designed to accomplish X. An example of that from my book is homelessness, where homeless shelters seem to be a very well-intentioned solution to the problem of homelessness. And in fact, they're perfectly designed to help people cope with homelessness. But they are not designed to end homelessness. So we might complain that there are a lot of homeless people and it's very dysfunctional and so on and so forth. But you have a system that helps people cope with homelessness by either being in shelters or, sadly, more and more certainly around California, living in tents or having to end up in the ER or in jail, and then recycling through all of these different emergency types of shelters. But the fundamental solution, if we want to end homelessness, is affordable housing, permanent, safe, affordable housing for people. And the system is not designed to end homelessness. So we may wring our hands about what we call a dysfunctional system, but it's actually accomplishing a purpose of helping people cope with homelessness. And so ultimately, if we're going to redesign that system, we have to, at some point, ask the question, what is the system perfectly designed to accomplish now? Because it will continue to accomplish that unless we're very deliberate and very committed to designing a system to achieve a different purpose.
Yeah. This is a really interesting concept in design and systems thinking is trying to figure out the system's goal and assuming that it actually is designed to achieve it. And so I wonder, is there importance to the word designed in that phrase to imply that someone actually intended it to? Because I use design as essentially intentional design of the systems. There's a human intention. So do we actually mean the person or the people who designed that system actually intended for it to just perpetuate the situation? Were they unconscious of maybe intending that? Or maybe their assumptions were working against that? What do you think the role of intent is here?
That's a great question. I think that very well-intentioned people often set up a system that they think will get them one result, but it ends up getting them a different result. And so the shelter system may have been designed to ultimately end homelessness, but people didn't take the next step of, we can't keep people in shelters all the time. We're going to have to ask them to leave after 30 days or after a week or whatever, and then they'll have to find other shelter, but then they come back to our shelter. And one of the other principles about systems, how systems behave, is that there's often a very big difference between the short-term outcome of a policy and the long-term outcome of the exact same policy. So homeless shelters seem like a very humane thing to do. And in the short term, they do put a roof over many people's heads. But the longer term consequences of the same solution are to reduce the visibility of the problem, to divert resources away from what would ultimately be a more fundamental solution of affordable housing, often in the US called housing first as a policy.
Yeah.
And another example of that is food aid. People are starving. We believe food aid will solve the problem. We care. We don't want to see people suffer. We send food. And in the short term, people who would otherwise starve have food. But there are longer term side effects to food aid coming in from outside of a country that actually increase the tendency for people to starve over time, by both the local agricultural system and also enabling the children who are the ones who most benefit from food aid to grow to childbearing age, where you get a population spike again, and you can see starvation occurring in 10 to 15-year cycles as a result of that. I think that a lot of well-intentioned people produce results that when they step back and look at it, they wouldn't want either.
Yeah. So that makes sense. And people use the term VUCA, V-U-C, to describe this world, or to describe many situations, which are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So we're talking about someone who means well, but maybe doesn't recognize the nature of the complexity of the problem, or just kind of reaches out for the most obvious solution. And that solution ends up being designed to perpetuate the problem, or becomes just one factor of the problem, one element that contributes to the problem.
Right, Aaron. And an important question that I raise with people whenever I work with them is, how might you, albeit unintentionally, be contributing to the very problem you're trying to solve? A guy named Bill Torbert, who is a professor emeritus of leadership at Boston College, put it so well. He said, if you are not aware of how you are part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. Which takes an adage and turns it on its head. It's, if you're not part of the solution, get out of the way, as opposed to the only way you can be part of the solution is if you're aware of how you're also part of the problem.
Interesting.
And I find that insight is enormously useful for people, even though it, can be initially challenging to consider that, particularly if I'm well-intentioned and I have solutions that seem to be helping people, and maybe hopefully even getting funded in a way to implement my solutions, to be asked to consider that I might actually be part of the problem as well. But there's enormous power, and this is not a matter of self-blame, that there's something wrong with me. It's very human to not fully appreciate all of the consequences of our actions, and to not understand how we may be part of a problem that we're trying to solve. But it's, on the other side, enormously empowering to make that discovery, because ultimately the greatest control we have over the system is in our own intentions, our own thinking, and our own behavior.
Yeah.
And when we can work on that, that will produce a lot of ripple effects in a positive way.
Interesting. You quote in your book Lewis Thomas, who said, when you're confronted by any complex social system, with things about it that you're dissatisfied with and anxious to fix, you cannot just step in and set about fixing it with much hope of helping. If you want to fix something, you are first obliged to understand the whole system.
I love that quote. I think it's very humbling. And to me, two of the big openings to being an effective systems thinker are being humble and being curious, not believing that one has the answer, because that allows for discovery of some of the unintended consequences of one's own actions, the different perspectives that we actually started our conversation with that are so important to cultivate. The one, even though I quote the second part of Thomas, which is the need to understand the whole system, I do that with a grain of salt. And I tell people that I don't think any of us are ever going to understand, quote unquote, the whole system, because ultimately that is way too complex and beyond our ability to apprehend. On the other hand, we can understand much more of the system than we typically do. And in expanding our understanding, we can be much more effective. And that's both individual understanding and collective understanding.
Yeah, in a way, trying to understand the whole system, you will end up including more and more until you end up with the whole universe.
Exactly. Now, he's a doctor. And so maybe from a medical perspective, we can understand the human system. But even then, I think both doctors and physicists are beginning to appreciate the power of social fields and energetic fields that extend beyond the physical body, which is what we would normally consider to be the human system. So even in medicine, we talk about the social determinants of health.
Yeah.
We talk about the power of prayer, or we talk about certain problems like obesity being social problems, not just individual problems, because how the people around us eat affects how we eat, and so on.
Yeah, it makes me think also of the microbiome, right? Which we thought we were one species, but we're actually dependent on all of these different bacteria species that we're just beginning to understand, and the quality of the air and water, and yeah, I think it's endless. I think you end up including everything if you.
And that is one of the challenges of doing this work, is you have to help yourself and certainly help your clients define a boundary somewhere. And how you define that boundary is ultimately a choice. There can't be any rules with respect to it, because in a sense it is all boundless. But by nature being human, we have to create limits and boundaries, or have to acknowledge the limits, that there are limits and boundaries, certainly to our capacities. And so that's also a very important part of this work, is helping people bound the system in a way that enables them to achieve more of the results that they want to achieve.
Yeah. And despite the impossibility of including everything, what are some of the benefits of using a system thinking approach when actually trying to produce change in the world? What are some of that are top of mind?
I think one is that it helps us understand the unintended consequences of our own thinking and behavior, that we're trying to accomplish one thing, but we're actually accomplishing something else. And then when we don't get the results we want, our tendency is to blame others in the system for falling short, instead of recognizing, discovering really how we have actually made things harder for ourselves by not appreciating some of these longer term unintended consequences of our own actions. That's at the individual level. The very important contribution at the collective level is that people are able to see more of the whole that they are trying to collectively impact. And the world is more complex, or that complexity is affecting us more than it ever has. And there are more needs to collaborate across different boundaries than we've ever had before. Collaborating with different organizations in our own sector, the need to collaborate across sector, the need even to collaborate with people we may perceive as enemies. There's so many. We've come to recognize that there's only so much we can do on our own. And America is an unusually individualistic society compared to most in the world. There are obviously benefits to that. But as the world becomes more complex, that individualist approach also becomes more limited and more problematic. And I believe that systems thinking is one way of helping people collaborate more effectively by collectively seeing more of the big picture, that they're all impacted. One of the best metaphors for this is an ancient Sufi story called The Blind Men and the Elephant. And that cartoon is actually in the book. It's imagine an elephant with blind people touching different parts of the elephant.
Yep.
And based on the part of the elephant that they're touching, they will swear that the elephant, if they're touching the trunk of the elephant, might say, that's a hose. And if they're touching the hair, they might say it's a brush. And if they're touching the ear, they might say it's a fan, etc. And based on their limited perception, that's the only part they can get. But all of them are part of the elephant, and the more they can see the whole elephant, the more effective they're ultimately all going to be. Yeah. Another very simple metaphor is if you imagine a huge beach ball and you're standing in front of the red stripe and someone else is standing in front of the green stripe, you'll swear the ball is red, somebody else will swear it's green, and you get into big arguments. And oh my gosh, there's a red aspect and a green aspect to this beach ball. And that's what we're dealing with, is a beach ball. So, there are lots of different approaches to helping people bridge their different viewpoints so that they can work more effectively with a more accurate picture of what's actually going on. And to me, systems thinking is one of those, and one that I love in part because it's a very visual language. It's a different language, and it's a visual language, and people can see literally the circles that they're in, going around in.
Yeah.
And I like to say that in order to help people create the circles they want, they first have to see the circles they're in.
Interesting. You wrote this fairly recently, a few months ago. It's a really interesting analysis in Foundation Review titled Overcoming the Systemic Challenges of Wealth Inequality in the US.
Yes.
And you're applying, first of all, it's really fascinating, but you're applying system thinking to analyze the different dynamics that connect, first of all, wealth inequality and race and racism and structural racism, and also some of the dynamics inherent in capitalism and inherent in our taxation system that make the rich richer, the poor poorer. And it's fascinating to see as you analyze these things that mindsets and beliefs end up playing a huge role in the system. They're part of what perpetuates the system, maybe even at the most fundamental level. Would that be a fair characterization?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I actually, in the article, I put 10 assumptions that tend to perpetuate wealth inequality. and by contrast, 10 assumptions that tend to further a more equitable and ultimately beneficial allocation of resources.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is if you're wealthy, there's a tendency often to assume that you're wealthy because you're better than other people. And you may be more hardworking. You may think of yourself as smarter or more hardworking, and other people are less intelligent or they're more lazy or whatever. When in fact, right now, the most significant indicator of likely success in the US is the zip code that you happen to be born into. And that's a very different mindset to recognize that, oh, I might be lucky in a certain kind of way, and I might be able to take advantage of the gifts that I've been given. But that ultimately leads more to an experience of gratitude and hopefully a desire to share than it does an attitude that I'm better than, more worthy than, and other people don't deserve.
Yeah. And at the same time, you're challenging some of these clearly self-serving ideas. If people are poor, it's their fault.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you also challenge some assumptions that are fairly common, I would say, on the left or on the anti-capitalistic side, which is things like the size of a wealth pie is limited. We can grow the size of the pie, right? And that's a point that I hear from people, from libertarians and people who support free markets. It's not a winner takes all, and it's not a fixed pie.
Right.
So it's a mix of ideas that don't necessarily belong to one side, but they have this tendency of perpetuating the system we live in.
Absolutely.
With its growing inequalities.
One of the books that I really enjoyed, Aaron, I appreciate your bringing up the political side of it, was Van Jones' Beyond the Messy Truth, speaking of a VUCA world. And he spends one chapter certainly questioning the assumptions of quote unquote conservatives, and another challenging the assumptions of liberals. And I think we are seeing more and more how the extreme positions that can be taken by either side in this political polarization are both extremely problematic and do not serve society as a whole.
Yeah, both sides are making their own contributions to the system because they're part of the system.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, it feels from this point of view, and you start looking at each system and you understand that you are a part of the system, because that's inevitable. And that in politics, that your side is part of the system. It's part of the machine that's producing whatever it's producing now. I think that is a much more productive way to look at ideologies in politics, that it is not tribal, that is not pointing fingers. That's trying to see the dynamics of this machine or this algorithm that we're running, and see what our part is and what happens if we did something else. I find that aspect really fascinating. So I'd love to talk about this more spiritual, mental/spiritual side of system thinking. And in the last chapter of your book, you write, thinking systematically is paradoxically not just a mental discipline, but also an emotional, physical, and ultimately spiritual one. And so talk to me about how is systems thinking spiritual, and how did you make that connection?
I think I first made the connection by realizing that both systems thinking and pretty much any religious tradition teach that everything is connected. And the question then becomes, to me, is it connected in ways that are beneficial or in ways that are dysfunctional. And you can think about, for example, a relationship with a significant other. Are you building each other up, or are you in some way tearing each other down? And so the question becomes, once we are aware that we are connected, what is required to create healthy connections and minimize dysfunctional connections? And to me, my answer to that in terms of systems thinking is that it requires certain characteristics, certain character traits that are often taught in spiritual traditions. Like I had mentioned earlier, I believe in our conversation, the importance of humility and curiosity.
Right.
And traditions talk about the importance of not knowing, of being open to the world. And that openness is part of creating healthier connections, because we're recognizing that there's an other out there that we're connected to. And the question is, how are we going to connect to it? But if we assume that sort of we are the world and the world is us, then we're not thinking in terms of connectivity at all. And it's very hard to be humble. It's very hard to be curious if I think that my world is the world. Another challenge that systems present is that people do have different points of view. And at least most people are trying to do the best they can with what they know at the time. So that requires an attitude and an experience of compassion, rather than blaming other people for having the assumptions that they have and doing the things that they do. It's more a matter of, geez, from their worldview, based on the part of the elephant that they are in touch with and have experienced in their lives, that is a natural set of conclusions and a natural worldview for them to have developed.
Right.
And people are much more likely to be open to changing if we can communicate compassion for their point of view rather than criticism. So compassion is another character trait, if you will, that's taught in spiritual traditions. And it's also very important for systems thinking to help acknowledge the different parts of the elephant that we're all in touch with. Another spiritual teaching is the importance of courage. And because there are solutions to problems, short-term solutions that make things worse over time, and we're not aware that those short-term solutions are actually making things worse over time, there's a tendency to jump on the bandwagon of short-term solutions under the assumption that if something is successful in the short term, it'll also be successful in the long term, right, when in fact that's often not the case. So it takes courage to take a stand for an approach that will serve more people in a more sustainable way over a longer period of time, but not be popular in the short term. In systems thinking, we talk about quick fixes. There's all sorts of things you can do in the short term that actually make no difference or make things worse in the long term. On the other hand, we all need small successes. We all need to feel that we're doing something that is moving the ball forward. And the challenge is to tease apart what's a quick fix and what's a small success. What just works in the short term, but actually is going to make things worse over time, versus what works in the short term and is building toward a more comprehensive, more sustainable solution in the long term. And it can take courage to take a stand for the long term and the short term actions that support the long term rather than are simply expedient in the short term. Another characteristic about systems is that they exhibit time delays. Some cause effect relationships take a long time to unfold. Right now, and anyone who's been a parent knows that how we parent our kids when they're 3 and 4 has a bearing on how they behave later on in life. Right. And I know for myself, it's been hard for me to hold limits with my son because it was so nice and so warm and juicy to just let him do whatever he wanted to do and how happy he was doing it. And yet it didn't really serve him when he started running up against a world of accountabilities and expectations and limits that I hadn't really set an appropriate foundation for. So we need to cultivate patience and we need to cultivate persistence to work with the time delays that exist in complex systems. And Lord knows patience and persistence are also character traits that are encouraged in spiritual traditions. So to me, there's quite a close mapping between the two. And so I have come to think of systems thinking in part as a spiritual practice.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Patience is definitely one that I'm most struggling with, I think. But when I started my master's, which has to do with Buddhism, my plan was to write about the connection between system thinking and the Buddhist concept of emptiness, which is are you familiar with shunyata or emptiness?
No, I've heard of it, but say more what emptiness means in the Buddhist tradition.
So it's a very philosophical term that emerges from the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, which is everything. It's Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism and Zen, essentially everything that came after the most early Indian Buddhism. And emptiness is defined as the lack of an inherent fixed essential nature for things. And what it replaces, so if you can think of a political party as having an essential fixed nature, or you can think of it as a dynamic, complex, ever-changing system. And which one reflects better like a political party? As we've seen, it's definitely more dynamic and it doesn't have an essence. Like if you take any party today, it's not the same as it was 100 years ago. But the same is true in Buddhism. The same is true with essentially everything. So it's a very fundamental attempt to move away from an object-filled reality into a systems-filled reality and dynamically changing systems. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole tradition of meditations around that, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, where multiple meditations that are just meant to foster that way of seeing. And so when I was talking to some systems thinking professors and kind of found out that nurturing systems thinking is actually something there's a lot of research on. How can you make someone a system thinker? Or how can you help someone become a systems thinker? And I was wondering whether some of these ancient traditions actually have meditations and actually have tools that can help you see the world in this way. And the sad thing, I ended up writing my thesis on something completely different, which drew my attention at the time, which has to do with artificial intelligence in Buddhism, which is a hot topic these days. But I still am very interested in kind of mapping these connections out, because like you said, it feels very similar to a spiritual tradition in a way, because it's a way of seeing the world. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? I'd love to hear what you think of this ramble.
I certainly understand that systems are continuously behaving and evolving. And what I try to do is capture some of the dynamic quality of that. And perhaps the closest that comes to a practical recommendation for what you've just described is the need for continuous learning.
Right.
The need to recognize that whatever model of reality we're able to capture and hopefully benefit from is by definition only a model. And it can be helpful to us, and it's a worthy endeavor to try to characterize a model. And at the same time, we have to hold our models lightly, if you will.
Right.
Because things are changing, because we never can apprehend the whole. And so our models are always incomplete by definition.
Yeah.
And so weighing the benefits of a model, which seems like a snapshot of something, even something that's changing, and the inherent recognition that whatever model we use to understand the world is by definition incomplete and needs to be continuously adjusted and adapted. It's the both and of that I find helpful when I work with people.
Yeah.
My guess is that the emptiness concept leans toward everything is changing. We need to be continuously present to what's emerging, and all of that's helpful. But in my experience, at least, people also benefit from models that at least capture what is going on or has been going on or could be going on as anchors for insight and action.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because what you're describing, that duality, definitely exists in Buddhism in the form of, this is called the two truths. And essentially, one is this truth of emptiness, which almost seems to annihilate knowledge because everything is too dynamic and too interdependent and always changing. And one is a more conventional view, which is useful, which is actually used to move and act in the world and be able to manipulate things to make them do what you want. And there's actually quite a bit of writing that celebrates both, that says both are needed. And so to me, that maps beautifully to what you just said, that you definitely don't want to go all out in the kind of, even the values that you described, humility, right? You go too far down the humility path, then you don't know anything and you can't do anything.
Yeah. We came across a book recently that we found very helpful called Unflappable. And it's basically about understanding polarities and how to work with polarities. And I had come across paradox type of work many years ago and actually wrote an article on it in the early 90s. But I found that this particular approach that's described in this book to be very helpful. And what you're describing whenever you talk about duality is that inherent tension that exists between one way of thinking about things, like we need something fixed to be able to work from, and the other way of thinking about things, that it's continuously evolving. And the challenge and the opportunity is to recognize that both are true, and how do you work with both of those in a way that each can serve the other in a way.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. So our time is almost up. So I have one final question for you.
Sure.
Which I find is a nice way to end. In his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton explains the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And he says a lecture is there to give you a little bit of information. Maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. And a sermon is there to change your life in some way. And so I would like to give you a stage for a short sermon For someone who wants to make a difference in this world, who wants to have an impact for the better in whatever field, what would you tell them? What is the one thing that could really change their lives?
Wow. I would say, so I think it would start with identifying what you really care about, where you want to make a difference in the world, what your unique passions or gifts are that enable you to make that kind of a difference, and to develop some kind of model or find some kind of model that helps guide you in translating your aspirations and your gifts into practical contributions, and then be willing and able to adjust that model over time as you actually get out there in the world and learn more and more about what works and what doesn't. It may or may not be related, but one of my favorite quotes is from a French philosopher, André Gide, who says, "Trust those who seek the truth, doubt those who find it." And so we need to be truth seekers, honest about ourselves, as clear-eyed as possible about what's actually going on out there in the world around us, and open to modifying our understanding of what's out there and to further developing our own capacities over time.
Wow. And with that, I want to thank you, David, for taking the time and sharing your wisdom. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Aaron. And I've really enjoyed it as well. Thank you for creating these opportunities for people and for embodying being a seeker in your own way.
Thank you. We try.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.